I think the origin of distroless in my mind, I mean, really, I don't even think about it as a way of reducing vulnerabilities. I think of it as a way of improving the signal to noise of vulnerability scanners, a way of making them actually more effective because the noise goes away.
This is DevOps Paradox, episode number 239. What's in your from line? A conversation with Chainguard. Welcome to DevOps Paradox. This is a podcast about random stuff in which we, Darren and Victor, pretend we know what we're talking about. Most of the time, we mask our ignorance by putting the word DevOps everywhere we can and mix it with random buzzwords like Kubernetes, serverless, CI/CD, team productivity, islands of happiness, and other fancy expressions that make us sound like we know what we're doing. Occasionally, we invite guests who do know something, but we do not do that often since they might make us look incompetent. The truth is out there, and there is no way we are going to find it. P.S. It's Darren reading this text and feeling embarrassed that Victor made me do it. Here are your hosts, Darren Pope and Victor Farsick. Victor, how do I know that you are you?
You don't. Are you now asking me for bizarre things like, do you want a drop of my blood to do the DNA test or something like that? Is that where this question is going to?
Well, it sort of depends. If you can prove that you are based on amber, Jurassic Park reference, everyone, and that's flowing through your blood, then maybe we can guess that you are you.
I don't have the answer to that, man. I mean, my family is not sure who I am, so I don't know what to tell you.
Why am I going down this horrible route and story? On today's show, we have Ville and Matt on from Chainguard, and we're going to be talking about software security, the wonderful acronyms that come out, seems every day. We'll look at SBOM and some other things.
No, before they introduce themselves, this is going to be a challenge. Are you going to be able to talk about the least interesting subject in an interesting way? I'm very curious now.
Well, we'll see about that. Anyways, doing fantastic, and thanks for having us on the show.
Yeah, doing great. Thanks for having us.
Where do we start? Obviously, Chainguard has been around for like 50 or 70 years, right? You've been listed on every major stock exchange.
Sometimes it feels that way.
Well, that's an interesting backstory from where you came from, right? Because in theory, you did come from major listed companies. What is sort of the history of Chainguard and then how the open source projects sort of expanded out of Chainguard?
Yeah, so I guess I can kick things off and Ville can tell me where I'm wrong as usual. The group of us that started Chainguard, we crossed paths a lot, in many cases across various open source projects. I think Ville and I initially crossed paths. He was helping start Kubernetes and I was starting Google's container registry team. And that led me to overlap with Dan and later Kim, who were doing stuff in the container space as well. And really, we just kept crossing paths again and again and again over the years until one day we had this great idea to start a company.
Ville, does that sound about right?
That sounds about right. Yeah, there was just a couple of things there. So one of the things that I did is I worked on something called cloud storage, Google Cloud Storage. And Matt would always come there and ask me to implement things so he could do the container registry stuff and everything else. And we became fast friends that way. And as he mentioned, then I went on to work on Project 7 at the time. You talked to Greg Boggs about this in your previous podcast. So I worked on that. And then a few years later, we started the Knative project together on top of Kubernetes because Kubernetes itself is too hard.
I have a question. Google Cloud Storage. Now, it's been a while since you've been there. Are there hard drives behind that?
Yes, sometimes.
Sometimes.
SSDs.
Okay.
Serverless has servers too.
He revealed the secret now. Now it's all exposed out in the open. There are servers behind servers, man. No, what I was about to say is that I thought that you guys are behind one of the things I'm very, very fond of. And now hearing about your past history, now you jump to two things I really, really like you were involved in. I mean, Knative, besides the images that I use all the time.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's nice to hear.
Ville was involved very early in Kubernetes. Dan and I started distroless and then tons of different tools. And, really a lot of the folks at Chainguard have come to join us from our various adventures in the past. So it's a pretty fun group of people.
So that's sort of your old world view, Project 7. By the way, if you don't know what Project 7 is, go back, as Ville said, and go back and listen to that episode with Craig Box. I don't have that number in front of me right now. But that's old world. What was normal
Wait.
for
What do you mean
world?
old? Knative is not old world. Don't give me that.
Okay, come on. I'm not saying... Go back to your corner. What was old world like from a security perspective? I mean, I think back to working in VMs back in the late 90s, back when they were still young. And it was like, honestly, we just didn't really care. Did it run? And hopefully we were just behind every possible firewall that we needed. What was it like for you guys?
So I remember those VM days, and it was always super duper fragile because you basically come in and you would go ahead and keep adding things into it until things worked. And then you stamped out at some point, I think ghosting was something that they used to call it, right? Where you basically freeze it and that way you can deploy it again. At the time when we were at Google, even before Kubernetes, everything we did was containers. So container world for us was normal. And it seemed goofy why people outside were not doing that because it was such a great way to do things. With the Dockers, and again, not going back into all the history stuff there, but that allowed for better or for worse. And I think because we are here today talking about what we are doing, there's a lot of worse there too, which is it allowed developers to go and have the same experience and almost sort of kind of bypass all these rules because you're like, just run my container, man. Trust me, it's good.
Yeah, Victor mentioned the distroless project, which is, in a lot of ways really tied into what we're doing today. And in the talk where, I originally sort of showed the world the original sort of distroless containers, I actually compared a lot of how Google had historically solved like running things inside those containers to the way sort of Docker had solved it, right? And if you squint and look at it, I'm a reformed compiler nerd. It's sort of like both solve it effectively through static linking, right? So Google would just say, you've told me all of your dependencies. I'm just going to link it all into these monstrous archive files. And, a lot of folks are familiar with jars, right? But they created it for every language. They had PAR files for Python. They had SAR files for Shell, like you name it. Every language had it. And, the C++ binaries were enormous. If you squint and look at what Docker's doing, Docker decided, hey, I can just statically link the file system into a container image, right? And it's got everything I need. And so if you think of the image as that kind of statically linked artifact, it draws some really interesting parallels when you start to think about it.
My experience with container images I've seen others are building is far from what you just said, everything I need. It's typically everything I need and have the internet on top of it, right?
That's exactly right. And I think that's sort of kind of the downside of how folks were trying to put the velocity of development in front of, it was all about getting stuff done. So the point of like, let me keep adding things into it. And I need to curl that one thing from there as well, because I need that when I'm actually building the image. So I think there wasn't a very good way for folks to go ahead and decouple the construction of the image, aka all the scaffolding and everything else I need to have around and all the tools. And if I'm installing packages, I need a package manager, but I don't need that when I'm actually producing the artifact or when I'm running it, right? So there wasn't a very good decoupling of the two separation of concerns. Like one of them is just the put in a whole bunch of stuff into this thing, turn the crank, and out comes this container with all the stuff that I needed to go ahead and produce the container. So I think that's something that I think is different with the way we were doing things over at the Google versus like how folks started to produce Docker images.
It took me a couple of years to come up with this analogy that I really like. I wish I had come up with this when I was giving that original talk, but you're exactly right, right? People are linking in so much more than they need today. And this analogy that I came up with is, if you're a Java programmer, you're probably familiar with something like Apache Commons or Guava or something like that, right? So it's like, I need some collections for my application. I want to use the Apache collections jar. So instead of linking the Apache collections jar, I link all of Jenkins just to get the Apache collections jar. It's nuts when you think about it like that, but that's really what people are doing, right? All they really need is something like glibc or ca certs to run their application inside of it, maybe a few more things, but like they're linking an entire distro like Debian or Ubuntu or whatnot, right? And it's way more than they need. There doesn't really exist the kind of declarative dependency information for building Docker files that like Google had when it was linking things, using its internal, I guess they externalized it as Bazel, the Blaze build system.
I feel that part of the problem lies from the very beginning of Docker. I remember when it appeared and everybody was psyched, and half of the population of the planet was comparing it with VMs. And I'm simplifying it now by saying this is like VM, just better. Right? And if this is like VM, just better, then how do you start? You start with Ubuntu or CentOS, because that's what I'm using in that VM. Hence, I'm going to put that in a container image. That's going to be the very first line. And then let's see.
I think that was critical to Docker's success, right? I mean, I hate that as much as anyone, but the reality is they made the container ecosystem accessible to folks who were used to bootstrapping VMs because they made it work with tooling like, starting from an existing operating system and tapping into existing package ecosystems. And, I'm not sure it would have been as successful if they made it so accessible to everyone in order to use it. But now we're sort of saddled with the legacy of having bootstrapped that ecosystem that way.
Well, you're touching on these base image concepts. You say from and big base image. Is there ever a time where that makes sense?
I can't think of one off the top of my head, but there may be one. I mean, if you're doing maybe something quick and dirty, and again, you are testing some things or whatever else, then maybe for that case, or you are not quite sure what the final product may be like, and when I say product, I mean the container, then perhaps you want to go and play around with it. But I think about the debugging and testing things is about the only thing that comes to my mind.
And even that, like debugging and testing, if you're running it in Kubernetes, right, it changed a lot since early beginnings, right? Now you have debug containers, right, that you can attach to your pods and so on and so forth. I feel that the bigger problem is the direction of things, right? Docker started on laptops and it tried eventually to get to production, ultimately failed. We got Kubernetes as a solution and so on and so forth, right? But if it starts on my laptop, I have no strong incentive not to have the tools that I need, right? Because what I need on my laptop is very different from what I need in production.
Yeah, that's totally true. I install very few tools on my laptop per se, and then I spin up containers where I do the development work. That lends itself very nicely to some of the things that we've been open sourcing with some of the tools with like AppGo and Melange and Wolfi that we can talk about in a little bit. But that is sort of kind of my workflow. So I try to keep my laptop fairly free of cruft for many things. One of them is because then I forget what was there. And I don't want things running on my machine. I think in those cases, like if I'm just putting together some sample container or some things, I might just go start a Docker container with like the Ubuntu in it. But if I'm playing around and trying to do things, maybe I want my Emacs there while I'm editing config files or things like that.
I completely agree with that, right? Like, I think what it comes down to is audience. Who's the audience of the container, right? I think one of the reasons the Ubuntu or Debian base is so popular is because it caters to a human who wants to bootstrap the rest of the system. And so if it's a container environment that like the developer is going to drop into, then by all means have stuff that's useful for the developer. I think one of the things we do in our images, while we try and have the core images be in the style of distroless, most of our images have a dev variant, which actually includes package manager, a shell, and some, well, it varies by application, but sometimes useful complementary tools. So like if the application's a web application, we'll include like curl or other things that, you would prototypically use for that application in a development situation, right? So I definitely think that if the containerized environment's catering to a human, having the things a human would want is great. But if it's for a runtime environment, making sure that that stuff's not there is frankly a great feature for security. I think one of the classes that has been getting a lot of attention recently is this class of attack called living off the land, where an attacker gets into the environment of an application and they don't even have to bring in their own tools because you've left so much good stuff for them already. Why would they need to bring their own tools? You left them, a shell and a package manager and curl or various other system utilities. And what are the odds that your application at runtime is like installing packages or doing other things that you would do with the base packages full distro, right? I mean, it's pretty small. I never say never, right? Like there's environments where you might do that stuff, but the vast majority of runtime environments don't need it. And so another analogy I like to make is sort of the JRE versus the JDK. I mean, I keep making Java analogies. I'm not a Java guy, but I think the duality of the JRE being like what you need to run it, and the JDK being like the environment that caters to the developer when they're trying to like make it work the first time, is a powerful analogy to the distroless variants and then the developer variants that include the more complete set of tooling.
Living off the land, and of course you left it as root or opensudo, right? So that makes it even better. But we've talked about these base images. Maybe as a developer, you go in, use it, going to what Ville was saying, right? You spin up a container, you spin up an image into a container, and you got tools in it. And that's fine. Maybe that one's a little bit heavier, if you will. But then we started talking about the security of those things. Where did that really start raising its ugly head? I mean, we could think, Log4Shell, SolarWinds. I mean, think about all the different variations of this. What happened in our world that started these things to really start happening?
Me personally, I think it goes back way before Log4Shell and stuff like this to things like Heartbleed. Log4Shell is really just, it was amazingly bad in terms of just how pervasive it was. But we've had a number of these incredibly high profile vulnerabilities over the years. And I remember when Heartbleed landed and it caught a lot of people by surprise. And there was a lot of spreadsheets floating around where it's like, well, gee, what version of OpenSSL, or, there's ones that have been in glibc and whatnot. These spreadsheets were like, what versions do we have where, and correlating all these things. I mean, this was really in the days before SCA scanners and container scanning was super prevalent. People were tossing these spreadsheets around and trying to figure out what they were running where. And honestly, the security scanners, I think they've enabled folks to build those spreadsheets a bit more quickly, but the spreadsheets are still around. And a lot of times it's now used to track the list of vulnerabilities that they do or don't have, right? And so I think in those cases, like Heartbleed and coming through to Log4j, there's a lot of containers that didn't necessarily have to be affected by certain OpenSSL vulnerability or certain glibc vulnerability because they didn't necessarily need those libraries in it, but because everyone builds their stuff from Debian, from Ubuntu, from whatever, they have things like glibc in there, and it's unclear whether or not something is using it, and you've built Go a certain way or built your C++ or Rust or whatever code a certain way. You don't necessarily need that at runtime. And if you can strip that out, great. I think some of it was rooted in that. I like to talk about the signal to noise, right? All the things you don't need ultimately pop up in scanners when they become vulnerable, and they're noise, right? I mean, they feed into things like being able to live off the land by using those tools, but ultimately, that's something that is legitimately in your container, that is legitimately vulnerable, right? Whether or not you use it is really where the noise comes from. And so stripping that stuff out is great if you have the sort of dependency information to make those things not appear in your container. So I think the origin of distroless in my mind, I mean, really, I don't even think about it as a way of reducing vulnerabilities. I think of it as a way of improving the signal to noise of vulnerability scanners, a way of making them actually more effective because the noise goes away. The things that are left in your container are things that are in your dependency chain, right? They're things that your application depends on in some way that's declared, right? And so they're things you should probably do something about, right?
I was going to go and just add one more thing into it, which is also by not really understanding what it is that you're running then has all kinds of other, not necessarily security related things, but if a project is no longer maintained or it comes to an end of life, do you even know what softwares you have to go back and fix and so forth? But I think the biggest problem with the base packages and having them be a bit more heavyweight than necessary is truly to go and open up different menus that really shouldn't be there in the first place. So don't make your life any harder. It's already hard. So don't make it any harder.
One of the fascinating things, at least to me, is how very often when I speak with people and suggest, okay, why don't you change your Ubuntu base image to Scratch image or Alpine or Chainguard or one of those? Or why don't you remove your CentOS operating system in favor of container optimized something, right? And the most common answer I always get is because it's work, right? I need to invest time to change things to this type of base image or this type of VM operating system, right? Now, the fascinating part in that story is that I have a feeling that the amount of investment that somebody needs to put is almost insignificant compared to the amount of investment that same company is spending fighting every single day, vulnerabilities popping up like crazy, and complaining about the cost because too much memory and CPU is used on in the system, and so on and so forth. It sounds like such an almost negligible investment to do compared to everything else we do because we don't do it in the first place.
Absolutely. And I think it's one of those things where it sometimes becomes hard, like even though it's a little bit of work, it is a little bit of work, to your point. You change it, in the most cases, you change the from line and you are off to the races. Where the things get a little bit tricky then is if you have many of these things and then people are like, oh, it's going to break everything, right? It's sort of kind of sometimes the same thing. It's just like, why don't you keep your dependencies up to date? And it's like, well, it might break things. And it's like, well, that's why we have tests.
Wait, that's why we have tests? Do you think people actually have tests? Isn't that a little bit of a jump?
I hope so. Dare the dream.
Yeah, I totally agree with the sentiment, though, around like the amount of time people are spending managing vulnerabilities. And honestly, I think that's one of the things that we see resonating the most with folks around, some of the stuff we're doing with Wolfi and Chainguard images is really that the vulnerability reduction and the elimination of that sort of toil, getting rid of the spreadsheets as much as we can enable folks to get rid of those spreadsheets of vulnerabilities, I think is really interesting and in some cases very mind-blowing. I mean, it still blows my mind just how much we can reduce some of our customers' vulnerability footprints by switching them out to either our base images or our application images in many cases. Getting rid of the spreadsheet, and we've had some customers tell us that something like 20% of their engineers' time is just spent triaging and dealing with vulnerabilities. I mean, it's mind-boggling numbers, and these aren't small companies, but it adds up, and it's a huge source of toil, right? Like, how many developers do you know that wake up and they're like, "Yep, I'm super pumped to go to work today and look at vulnerabilities in a spreadsheet"? I can't think of anybody.
That's why I don't fully agree with what you said. You said triaging and fixing or something like that, right? I think it takes so much time to triage things that you don't get to the fixing part. Kind of, oh, I already spent my allocated time triage going through it. Kind of like I cannot fix anything.
Yeah, and honestly, the thing that worries me about the noise, right? The noisy aspect of it is there's so much noise, and a lot of people are like, yeah, don't pay attention to the noise. It's in things you aren't loading at runtime, so like, oh, you're not really vulnerable, but like. The noise, right? Noisiness from any tool starts to desensitize you to the tool. It's like a flaky test. It flakes enough, you just like, okay, rerun, whatever. it leads to bad habits, right? And so what happens when a new instance of a vulnerability pops up in an application that like where it is actually used at runtime? Have you been desensitized to that particular vulnerability? Or what happens when you have so much noise that maybe it's hard to spot new vulnerabilities coming in over time, right? That it becomes a needle in a haystack, right? So it requires you to be very vigilant, and remaining vigilant in the presence of that much noise, I think, is very, very taxing.
It's taxing and it's wasteful because then people invent new ways of dealing, processes and tools to go ahead and deal with the with the triaging process instead of getting rid of that in the first place.
So in other words, what we're doing is we are treating the symptoms instead of removing the cause.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. I love that you said that, because when we were first getting started as a company, my wife's a doctor, and we literally made the comparison of like, what we are doing is, in many cases, preventative medicine versus treating the symptoms. So it's a fantastic analogy.
One of my first, and that was many years ago, I don't remember the exact scenario, but one of my first contact with security scanning was that I got a notification that there was some library, something that was vulnerable. I could not, I spent hours trying to figure out, there was no upgrade, there was nothing, trying to figure out what the heck should I do, until I just removed it. Because I honestly did not even know what it does. And I'm talking long before containers and all this stuff. What happens if I remove this thing, right? Did anything break in production? No. Excellent. Vulnerability fixed.
Well, and that's actually the best way to fix a vulnerability, is just remove things until nothing is left.
Precisely.
So from a Chainguard perspective, y'all have some open source projects. Some I have actually used. APKO, I still call it that, or APKO, I believe is how you referenced it. I can't go there yet. I'm still in my APKO days. And you called out one that I hadn't used before, was Melange. Okay, I'm going to ask this as a very loaded question. In the past few years, a number of companies have decided to change licenses for things that were open source to not open source licenses, or not open source friendly licenses. I'm not a lawyer, but let's say that for a minute. How do I know you're not going to rug pull out from underneath me once I start using projects from Chainguard?
That's a spicy question. I can do my best to answer that. As a company, right now, like all of our founders and a significant part of the engineering organization, we're all people who got to know each other and, become like teammates even before some of us ever really actually were teammates through open source. We're, I think, very committed to open source. And, Wolfi itself, we try and align very much with the sort of FOSS software and, keep the things in it. I mean, some of the licensing changes you mentioned have been a little disruptive because we had some things packaged in Wolfi that we had to stop packaging in Wolfi because they changed their license. So everything in Wolfi is FOSS today. Melange is the tool that we use to turn software into packages. We use the APK format, which is also used by Alpine, similar to how, Debian and Ubuntu use dpackage, and Red Hat and SUSE and Amazon Linux and all use RPM, right? So we're aligned around the APK format. So Melange is the tool that we use that turns software into APKs.
I'm just going to say in a declarative way. So we basically can go ahead and make sure that they're also reproducible. That's going to be important for some things later on if we get to it.
Yeah. And then APKO is what we use to effectively assemble distroless style images from those APKs based on all of the dependency information. It's sort of hard to do, more than sort of pinky swear at this point around where those things live and saying, just trust me. We've talked about it, candidly, we've talked about sort of where those live and things like that. Having come from, let's say, former communities that shall remain nameless that dealt with certain open source whiplash, I'm very sort of jaded on doing things. I don't want to overcorrect in terms of preventative measures, but like I'm very receptive and whatnot to conversations around like where things like APKO and Melange live. But like, I don't think we want to be over-eager about moving it here or there or whatever, right? So I think we've debated in the past, like, should Melange actually live under the Wolfi org, which, we intentionally try and keep separate from the Chainguard org because we want to run it in a sort of properly open source manner. We contribute to Wolfi with our open source hats on, and we've had the debate about like, does it make sense to move it there? Would that inhibit folks from using it to build APKs for non-Wolfi distros, which I think is a legitimate question, right? Like, would it inhibit someone from trying to build an Alpine APK with a tool like Melange? And I don't think we want to erect any sort of roadblocks to that. And so, we've debated this, and, I think we remain very open-minded about it. Nobody's really come and asked us to move those things to either separate orgs or, we haven't had the sort of foundation conversation yet, but I think you'll find that certainly amongst, Ville and I and Dan and Kim from previous lives, we've all been involved in projects that we've either taken or tried to take into foundations like CNCF and CDF and others, right? SigStore into the OpenSSF is another great example. At our core, I would say open source maintainers, and hopefully we have some credibility in our sort of pinky promises at this point. But, I would say the real thing is, folks really want to have a conversation about that, engage with us, or have concerns about where things live currently, definitely reach out. But we haven't heard it yet. And we have no plans to change the sort of governance in a, twist my mustache Bond villain way.
How did you guys end up on APK? What was the thing that made you go, this is it?
We basically have some folks who are very well established in Alpine communities, and it's very well done. It truly is very well done. It's clean, concise. It does all the engineering things that make it, in my opinion, very nice, clean, and great implementation. And then we also had a lot of familiarity with it to begin with.
Ariadne in particular is one of the core folks who's been leading a lot of our efforts around Wolfi and Melange and APKO. When we were sort of getting started, she had been experimenting with stuff in the sort of distroless space around the APK format and with tooling in this space. And, it was very aligned with some of the things that we had been thinking about doing. When Dan and I did the original distroless, we committed quote unquote crimes with Bazel to make the deb files produce images. And we, I think, learned a lot from that. And so, it's lessons in what not to do. And so we had been following some of the stuff that she'd been doing with projects like Witchery pre-Chainguard. And she'd put a ton of thought into this. And, we appreciated that thoughtfulness. And I think she'd been doing some groundwork in tools and formats like APK to enable some of the ideas behind what we're doing. And I think that was central to us deciding to align around APK. I think one place where it sort of got interesting was APK is really often associated with Alpine, and there's even misconceptions that the Chainguard images are Alpine based. I think one of our decisions really early on was Alpine is great in many ways and, uses the muscle or musil, depending on how you pronounce it. Well, we can have another whole debate on pronunciations there. There's a lot of things that folks have run into over the years around compatibility with that. And so, we wanted to sort of optimize for compatibility with what folks expect. And, so much software expects glibc as the libc implementation. Dan told this joke in the early days of us building distroless, which was like, there's all these charts that compare how compatible libc implementations are, but they're all missing a column, which is this glibc? And it's almost the most important column. And I always thought that was sort of funny because I think in a lot of cases, people sort of expect bug for bug compatibility for better or for worse with glibc. So I think that fed a lot into us deciding to sort of build our own distro as well.
You mentioned SigStore. What is that about?
SigStore is basically a project that allows people to go ahead and sign artifacts. And when I say sign artifacts, it also means things like attestations. So you can say some things about an artifact. It's a really kind of a clever way to do this. The one, I think, a game changer there was the keyless aspect of it, because far too often folks go ahead and, well, most people that I know, myself included, was you set up basically the GPG keys or SSH keys one time when you go and set up the laptop, and the the time you rotate those is when you get a new laptop. And with everybody now, so you basically have these huge long-living credentials that basically are keys to the kingdom, if you will, controlling everything from who do you show up and you go commit things into GitHub, right? You sign them with those long-lived keys. And with the SigStore, the idea there is that you can basically use OAuth and OIDC flows to go and have very short-lived credentials with much tighter controls because, well, like Google OAuth, you can tighten them down like I require two-factor auth and so forth. So SigStore is a project that allows you to go ahead and sign and add things about artifacts as well as then verify them. I think this might be, it's not going to exactly answer the original question that we kind of started this with, but how do I prove who you are, right? So by using SigStore, it allows you to go ahead and answer questions. Where did this container come from? How was it produced? What's inside of it? Should I trust it?
Just to echo that, the keyless signing thing was a mind-blowing thing to me because I think, as Ville mentioned, when you're dealing with like GPG keys and SSH keys, for one, you are now in the business of managing keys, and it's a long-lived credential, which you need to be very careful with. But I think the other aspect of GPG and SSH keys is there's a sort of identity problem, right? Like, do you go around and remember everyone's hex string that represents their verification key? No. One of the things SigStore manages to do by tying into the identity provider flow for this keyless signing is it sort of solves the identity resolution problem of associating a particular signature with the identity of the person who signed it. So you can make policy decisions not based on who had access to Ville's key, which we now know is everyone, but who is actually able to successfully go through the sort of identity challenge. And I like to make the comparison of identity challenge because a lot of people compare what SigStore does with keyless signing to Let's Encrypt. And so if you're familiar with Let's Encrypt for provisioning TLS certificates for your website, there are these challenge flows that you go through to prove that you control a particular host name or you control a domain in order to get certs, right? And so what you do with SigStore to get one of these short-lived keyless signing certificates is you go through what I refer to as an identity challenge, right? You prove that you are Matt or Ville or Victor, right? And that way, you aren't managing any long-lived keys locally, right? You are sort of piggybacking on very well-established identity-oriented security. We talked at the very beginning, you guys were talking about how do we know you are who you say, right? Like that solves the sort of authentication piece. And then where things like authorization come in are around policy and things like that, which, Ville was mentioning.
I'm not sure that the keyless is a good idea. I see nothing wrong with sending my keys to my colleague to verify that I'm me. What's wrong with that? Email. No, Slack. And it sounds that I'm joking, but I've seen actually keys being passed by emails in Slack. So it's working.
There's so many breaches in recent memory where a long-lived signing key got leaked. And, I think Microsoft had several recently where it was like, okay, long-lived key was leaked. Personal goal for Chainguard, we never handle long-lived secrets for users. It may be aspirational, but so far, we've largely managed to stay away from that. And it helps me sleep at night, right? Because, you can't leak what you don't have. So many of these breaches have to do with a credential leak, a signing key leak, or you name it. I sleep better knowing that we avoid them like the plague.
One more word you guys had said was Wolfi. I'm assuming that's not Wolfgang Van Halen.
No, it's kind of we call it undistro in a sense because it is truly the minimalist way of basically having a container runtime. And it includes things like no kernel. So we have even taken the kernel out of it because you don't really need a kernel for containers because that always comes from the container runtime. The way you go ahead and then basically build things in top of the Wolfi or the packages. So there's a list of packages in Wolfi-dev/OS where you can go and install those packages, the Alpine or the APK packages we just talked about. then you can go ahead and construct full-blown containers using the APKO tool we just talked about. So Melange is a way to go ahead and craft packages in a Wolfi-compatible way, and then the way you create containers is by running APKO for those packages.
What he said, I think Wolfi also, it enables us to really curate the dependency structure of everything, make sure that applications are broken down into fine enough packages that you can include the things that you actually need and not the things you don't need, so that we can ultimately build distroless images that have what you actually need and don't have what you don't need.
So in order to delete the spreadsheets, what do I need to change my from line to?
So that's a good question. I was just sort of tweeting about this yesterday. I think the key thing that we strive for in Wolfi, you can have as I said before, a sort of non-distroless Wolfi build, right? And I think the key to staying vulnerability free is making sure that everything you're running in your containers is patched. Now, you don't actually have to go distroless in order to remain vulnerability free. But the rate at which you will accumulate vulnerabilities goes down with things like distroless. So you probably should anyways. But if you want something that's usable on, say, a from line with a Docker file, you can change that to cgr.dev/chainguard/wolfi-base. And that'll get you an environment pretty similar to what you'd get with, say, Alpine. It has a minimal set of POSIX utilities from BusyBox and APK. And it'll allow you to bootstrap a container. And we keep that basically vulnerability free by applying every upstream patch as quickly as it lands and as quickly as we can get the builds out the door. Everything we have sort of builds around that same sort of philosophy. And we try and strive to make it as distroless as possible.
And then so that's the base there, but sometimes it depends if you're running an application on top of something else. Like if you're running like Nginx and you just put your application code in there or something like that. We also have images for those as well. There isn't just one place to go ahead and do, but you can go ahead and look at the Chainguard images, and there's a big list of those. So if you are having a from baseline or from some image, go take a look and see if there's a Chainguard alternative for it.
Yeah. Wolfi base, we've got language runtimes, language tool chains, and then, we do have a large number of applications built in the distroless style. So depending on what you're looking for, we may have it.
You take everything from upstream and build the image. Seems like you've got your CI/CD process down pretty tight.
It's a work in progress, but it's getting better and better every day. It is a lot of work, and we are building a lot of software.
Unless I'm mistaken, you're building the images daily, right? Every day there is a new tag, or did I get it wrong?
Public and private have slightly different cadences. I think right now the public images build once a day, and the private images we build much more frequently. I think we build it every couple hours during business hours, and that includes a full rebuild of everything that we do on the public side, and then we distribute it out to customers.
Chainguard is at chainguard.dev. Matt and Ville, thanks for being with us today.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us. That was a lot of fun.
We hope this episode was helpful to you. If you want to discuss it or ask a question, please reach out to us. Our contact information and a link to the Slack workspace are at devopsparadox.com/contact. If you subscribe through Apple Podcast, be sure to leave us a review there. That helps other people discover this podcast. Go sign up right now at devopsparadox.com to receive an email whenever we drop the latest episode. Thank you for listening to DevOps Paradox.